Hello and welcome back to another video. In this video I'm going to show you how to level, crown and dress the frets on a guitar fretboard. This is just a cheap neck off a cheap guitar I'm just fixing up at the moment. So yeah, I don't want to waste any of your time. Let's get started. Alright, so you don't need a whole lot of tools to do this. I'm going to use some tools that I used when I first started out because I want to show you that you can do this with cheap tools and minimal tools as well. So let's get started and explaining exactly what we'll need to do this job. So the first thing we'll need is some kind of straight edge just to make sure that the neck is straight before we start the job. This is just a standard cheap level from a hardware store. If you want to get serious, you can buy a notched straight edge, and that's basically like a ruler with notches, and that sits directly over the frets so that you can actually see with your fretboard straight. There is a risk of using a level on your fretboards, and that's if you've got frets that are higher and lower than others, you may not get a true position of the neck being straight, whereas with the notch straight edge, you're actually measuring right against the fretboard and not the frets. But I've done this plenty of times with a level and it's always worked out good. So yeah, straight edge like this. And then you'll need something to actually level or sand the frets. This here is a cheap sanding beam. It's from Amazon. And you can, I don't know if you can see inside it, but it's got different grits on either side. So that's 600, then there's a 1200, then there's a 400 and 1000. So I'll most likely be using the 400 to knock most of the fret material off while we're working. And yeah, so that's a little level sanding beam. You can also use a sharpening stone, but just be sure and check before you use it that it's actually flat. This one, when I got it, needed a lot of work to make it flat. It had a big bow in it. So just be sure whatever you're using is dead flat. And yeah, with a sharpening stone, don't use anything too harsh. I use this side here, which is quite smooth. And that does a really good job. But if you want, pick one of these up. They're actually really good. And you can get them in different lengths as well. You'll also need some masking tape. Doesn't really matter what width, but yeah, just to cover the actual fretboard because you don't want to get anything on there. So yeah, simple masking tape. This is just a painter's tape from the hardware store and it works great. So the next thing you'll need is a Sharpie or any other kind of black texture. I like black because it shows up easy, and I'll show you why we're going to use this later. You'll also need a crowning file. Now this again is one of those really cheap ones off Amazon, and as you can see, there's a little file inside here, and that's what we're going to use to crown the frets, which we'll get into a little bit more later. This again is from Amazon. It's a really cheap tool, but it works really, really well. I was actually impressed with it when I got it when I first started crowning frets and things. So yeah, this is really good. Then you'll need another little file, kind of like a triangle file, three-sided file. This is just for filing off the fret ends to make sure they're not sharp. I probably won't need to do that on this guitar because they're already pretty good. I'm going to go over how to use this, but I probably won't need to use it on this particular neck. And what I also like to use is some 4-0, so quadruple 0 steel wool. This is equivalent to roughly like probably a 400 grit sandpaper. So you can use different grades of steel wool instead of sandpaper, but I like to use this in with sandpaper as well. And then I also just use an 800 grit sandpaper and a 1500. You'll also need some kind of cutting or polishing compound. This one here is a cutting compound. It's roughly equivalent to 5000 grit sandpaper, and this is an ultra fine polish. So what I usually do, you don't have to do this, but I do get a bit of a nicer finish. I'll use this first and then I'll follow up with this just to get a bit of a smoother finish, but we'll go into that later in the video. And last but not least, we'll be using here what's called a fret rocker. You can use anything that's this size, that's basically level, and that's just used to check if your frets are level. And there's different size sides so that you can work your way down the fretboard, because obviously as you get to the higher frets, you just can't get in between them. So this one here will allow you to measure 2 or 3 frets at a time, just to make sure they're not rocking. So if you don't have one of these, you can just use basically any kind of scrap that is straight. The first step is making sure that our neck is straight. If the neck isn't straight, you're not going to be leveling them flat and your frets will be all over the place. To do this, place a straight edge against your neck and check if it is straight. If it isn't straight, adjust your truss rod until it is. You can also use a notch straight edge which will sit right on top of your fretboard. This is the proper tool to use, however I want to use just a level directly on the frets to show that you can do this with mostly basic tools. The risk of using the frets to check if the neck is straight is that some of the frets may be higher or lower and not give you a true indication on the straightness of the neck. This neck has a lot of back bow and the truss rod will need to be adjusted before we begin. If your neck isn't straight and needs to be adjusted, you first have to work out whether you have a back bow or an up bow. A back bow is when the middle of the neck is sunken down towards you as if you were playing the guitar. An up bow is when there is an upwards bow facing away from you in the middle of the neck. If you have a back bow, then you need to tighten your truss rod. This usually means turning it clockwise. If you have an up bow, then you need to loosen your truss rod. This usually means turning it anti-clockwise. However, when the strings aren't on the neck, it can change things as there is no longer any pulling tension, so adjust your truss rod and check the neck is getting straighter. If it's getting worse, turn the opposite way. Keep making small adjustments at a time until the neck is straight. Be very careful, if there is too much tension on the truss rod, it can be damaged. Now we're ready to begin. Start by masking up your fretboard, leaving the frets exposed. The larger frets are easy to mask, but you may need to cut smaller strips of tape for the narrower frets down the neck. Make sure to also mask down the sides of your neck. The polishing part of this procedure can get a little bit messy and you don't want anything staining or getting on your neck. If you're doing this with the neck still on the guitar, be sure to mask up things like your pickups. They are magnetic and any metal shavings will end up sticking to them. For me, this neck has already been removed from the guitar, so I don't need to worry about that. It's a good idea to use a fret rocker or similar tool to firstly check where the high and low points of your frets are. This isn't a mandatory step, it just gives you an idea of what's going on before we begin. Now that everything is masked up, we can begin. Start by grabbing your Sharpie or texter and marking the top of each fret all the way down the fretboard. This is a great way to see where our high and low points are once we start sanding. Using your sanding beam, start sanding the frets, working your way up and down the fretboard in long strokes if possible. You should start to see areas where the texture is being sanded away and possibly areas where it isn't. Any areas that still have texture are low points and it means the surrounding frets must be sanded more until there is no texture left on any of the frets. I like to do a couple of passes with sanding, so I'll mark the frets with the texture again and repeat this process until the texture is gone. Now that we've leveled the frets, I like to take a little bit more off fret 15 and below. This just allows you to run a little bit lower string action and alleviate some of the buzzing that is usually caused by those frets. I do this purely by feel. Now we're ready to crown the frets. We need to recrown the frets because after sanding they become flat and will not play properly. The idea of crowning frets is to make the top of the fret where the string touches only a small point with a nice round over to it. This crowning file is just a cheap file you can get on Amazon or eBay in Luthier toolkits. It works fantastically. You can also do this process manually with a normal file, but it is a lot harder and not recommended for beginners. I always use a crowning file, it's fast and it works great. Before we start, we are going to mark our frets once again with our texter. This will show up any areas that haven't been crowned properly yet. As we start to use our crowning file, you'll see that the line I have drawn on the fret gets thinner. We are aiming to just be left with a thin line of texter right on top of the fret. Now that we've finished crowning our frets, I'm going to get my fret rocker once again and just check we don't have any frets that are sitting too high or too low. You want the fret rocker to sit on the frets without rocking back and forth. This guitar doesn't really require it, but sometimes your fret ends may be rough or sharp. This often happens when your neck shrinks, the frets have moved, or is usually required when a neck has been refretted with new frets. To round off the fret ends, just grab a triangle file and start filing off the end. As you push the file over the fret end, you'll also be curving inwards to smooth off those edges. Now that we're done with the heavy lifting, it's time to start making these frets look good. We're going to grab our 4-0 steel wool and rub down the frets. This will remove any deep scratches that may have been left by our sanding and filing. You can already tell it's starting to look really nice. Now that we've steel wooled our frets, I'm going to rub some 800 grit sandpaper over them, followed by some 1500 grit sandpaper. Things should start looking pretty smooth by now, and we're nearing the end. All we have left to do now is to polish the frets to get back that beautiful shine and remove any scratches made in the previous steps. If you have a Dremel or other polishing tool, use that as it's definitely faster. If not, you can definitely do this by hand, it may just take a little bit more time. Once you're happy you've removed the scratches and your frets have a nice shine to them, you're done. You can now see why we mask off the fretboard. The process does get very messy. Wipe off any excess polish with a clean cloth and then we can begin to unmask the neck. We've now unmasked the neck and the frets look fantastic. They're shiny and look like something you'd see in a jewelry store. Usually at this point I'd also oil or at least clean the fretboard before everything else goes back together. These frets are looking great. Alright, and we are finally done. So at first it seems like it's a quite intimidating process, but once you start going, it's actually really easy. The main thing is make sure your neck is straight, because otherwise you're going to be sanding valleys or mountains into your fretboard or into your frets. So yeah, all done pretty easy. One other thing you can do is if you use a level, you can actually get adhesive sandpaper, stick that, and that can become your little sanding beam. There's plenty of ways to do it, and there's a bunch of cheap tools on Amazon. The more expensive tools are obviously better, but the cheap tools do a great job nonetheless. Hope that helped. If it did, please subscribe, like, comment on the video. If you have any questions about the process, please let me know down below. And that's it. Now back to putting this on the guitar, getting the strings on. Make sure to adjust your truss rod again once your strings are back on. And that's it. Hope you enjoyed. I'll see you all again soon.